and we'll have him located. I think I see him coming in. Welcome, Jeff. How are you?
Hey, how are you doing, Kevin? Good to hear from you.
Yeah, good to have you back. You're actually on a pretty clear line. Now, where are you exactly?
Beijing, China.
Okay, Beijing. All right, cool. And it's a time of day where they're not using the internet too much, so you can talk with us.
So far, so good. It's actually 8 in the morning here on Saturday. We're having a beautiful day. The weather's just spectacular, clear sky, not much pollution, and so I'm really happy to talk to you, and looking forward to our show together.
Well, it's fantastic to be able to bring you in and have you tell us things that the corporate media won't tell us. You know, just a few years ago, you couldn't do that. There was no way we could get an alternative voice on to talk about China live from Beijing, China, the way we can now.
Hey, listen, you asked me the last time on our last show we talked about 9/11 in China and the consciousness of China, and that you had some indications from the architects and engineers, for the 9/11 truth, if they were maybe hoping to get some traction here and some support from the Chinese. And I promised you I would do some investigation on that. Would you like for me to tell you about it?
Absolutely. You know, I have a friend who's an engineering professor who looked into this a little bit on behalf of architects and engineers, and he was of the impression that they might be able to get a whole lot more signatures than just the 2,200 they've gotten so far if they went over to China. So what did you find out?
So they're over 2,000 now. Wow.
Yeah, it's over 2,200 last I checked, maybe more than that by now.
Wow. The last time I checked it was like 1,800. Well, that's great news. Well, I can tell you what, for our listeners out there, I do speak and read Chinese fluently, and I'm in contact with Chinese daily, and before everybody hangs up, just bear with me, but I will have to say that 9/11 is not at the top of the list of consciousness among the Chinese. If you web search in Chinese for 9/11, you get the usual echo feeds, from the Western media and from the Taiwan, Singapore media in Chinese. And there, it's just in Chinese. There's just, instead of the millions of hits in the United States or in the West, you've got thousands at the most. And then if you filter it down to false flag and 9/11, you only get a couple of pages of references. And so, and they
at least it's a manageable research project.
Yeah,
that's the good news.
And what it is, do you really believe the official line? And alluding to black hands, which is a Chinese term, black hands, powerful Western forces causing it. So it's out there, but here's the deal, Kevin. The problem is that the Chinese have got their hands full with the Americans pulling off false flags in MH370, Tibet, now Xinjiang. Tiananmen Square. I think, and also
exactly. So that's why we take down, we expose 9/11, and that stuff stops. Come on, you Chinese leaders, what don't you understand about this?
I told you last time there was a British guy named Paul Taylor who actually gave a 9/11 talk here a couple of years ago at a Beijing university. He gave me the email of his local person that he worked with on that, and I emailed that guy. He never responded back. I've asked a few people around, in Chinese, what do you think about 9/11? And they, it's so long ago, and it's just not a front burner issue. Now, if you bring up Xinjiang and Tibet, they're on board. They know that that there are there's destabilization going on in Tibet and Xinjiang. So I think that for the Chinese, and also you have to understand, I don't know how much luck the architects and engineers are going to have, because China has a very firm commitment. They actually live up to it, to not interfere in other countries' internal affairs. And so for them to make a big deal out of the falsity of the American propaganda would suggest that the Chinese are meddling in America's affairs. So I can I'll be happy to try to if that guy from Architects and Engineers wants to get a hold of me, I'll be happy to try to put him in touch with some people. But given the fact that China is, scrupulously avoids meddling in other countries' affairs, I don't know how much luck he'll have, but I'll be happy to help.
And that's been one of the problems that we've had with getting countries that should be sympathetic to lend a hand for 9/11 truth. That attitude of we don't meddle in other countries' affairs is actually pretty common around the world. In fact, I believe that it was General Ivashov, the top Russian general who talked about 9/11 being an inside job, who said that when he and the other Russian commanders were, of course, at their emergency posts on 9/11, not knowing what the heck was going on, the U.S. went on a red nuclear alert and basically pointed its nukes and started itching its trigger finger. And so the Russians were pretty worried. It looked like maybe there was somebody going to start a world war,
like a feint to attack or something like that.
Yeah. So, but then when they deciphered what was going on, and apparently they saw some satellite pictures that made it clear, as Ivashov said, we realized it was a purely internal American matter. So they've basically been respecting it as a purely internal American matter ever since, much to my chagrin, because, when America sneezes, the world catches cold, and when America,
the flu,
right,
pneumonia.
Pneumonia, yeah. When America invades and occupies the world, which it's constantly doing, the world suffers. And so the world owes it to us to support the 9/11 truth movement. So all foreign governments should immediately funnel lots of their money into my coffers so I can beat the drums for 9/11 truth, right?
Well, Kevin, what I'll do is I'll go knock on the door of Zhongnanhai, where the Chinese leadership lives, next door to the Forbidden City, and I'll tell Xi Jinping to get in touch with you.
I appreciate it. I look forward to hearing from him ASAP.
And I'm sure that China's the equivalent of Russia's FSB and America's CIA / NSA. I'm sure their Ministry of State Security, which is abbreviated MSS, I'm sure they know everything too. I mean,
I'm sure those guys aren't stupid.
No, they're very, very capable, and in fact, I think they're America's equal, as you can see, even in the mainstream press. They're just driving America nuts with their outstanding, cyber penetration and cyber technology. So,
if any of them are listening right now, let's give them a shout out.
That's right. So anyway, I wanted to, I mentioned to you as we were getting ready for this show, if anything about, we had Arizona, we had MH17, and Ukraine, and then in March of 2014 we had MH370, which. In which China was very, very much involved, and I just wanted to find out from you. I did read Matthias Chang's article on your website, and about how he thinks it was done for, basically big business in the United States and in Europe to make billions off of anti-terrorism. But I'm just wondering, has he changed that since now that we've had, the trifecta, the hat trick of 3 Malaysian airlines being, planes being sabotaged? Has he changed his position any about, why they would be picking on Malaysia?
He probably has, but I haven't had him back on to talk about it.
Okay.
But do you think it's kind of a weird coincidence that right after the Kuala Lumpur tribunals find Israel guilty of genocide, that planes start dropping out of the sky?
Well, it's not just Israel. Here's what I think, Kevin. I think that the Kuala Lumpur, the Malaysian War Crimes Commission had 3 cases, and in one of them they convicted Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld. I think in another one they convicted Blair. And then they had another one. No, yeah, that's right. They convicted Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Blair in the first one about Iraq. The second one they convicted Israel because of Palestine. And then the third one was because of Abu Ghraib in Guantanamo. And it's almost like biblical revenge, an eye for an eye. You have insulted, the great Western powers of, the United States and England and Israel, and so
we're going to randomly murder a bunch of people by taking down planes.
Well,
that's probably how they think.
And so 3 Malaysian airplanes for 3 convictions in a war crimes commission from Malaysia. And the fact that Malaysia is multi-ethnic, it's predominantly Muslim. It has had a proud tradition of standing up to Western colonialism, and so that's what I think.
That's right. They've been standing up against the banksters since the Asian Tigers crisis, when Mahathir Mohamad told Soros and the Rothschilds to go stick it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not only lived to tell the tale, but they actually were the only Asian country that did well. I mean, of all of those countries afflicted by that particular crisis, the others suffered much, much worse. Malaysia got out of it fast, got out of it easy, by putting on currency restrictions and basically doing the exact opposite of what the Rothschilds were telling them to do.
Yeah, to restrict capital outflows, and they probably even put controls on the exchange rate and everything else. So
exactly.
Did you ever see on my website the article that I wrote about MH370 about 5 weeks after it happened, and I just want to find out if you had heard the story that based on the research that I had done about it going north into either Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Kazakhstan. Are you familiar with that?
Not really. I just got back from a book tour. I was driving frantically around the heartland of the United States for most of the past week. So if I did read that article, I'm forgetting it now.
Well,
go ahead and tell our listeners.
Okay, great. Well, it's really interesting because right after MH370, most of the people on that plane were Chinese. It was a huge deal here. I mean, it was like, all over the media, the social media. I mean, you can imagine it really shocked the country. And so in Chinese on WeChat, which is the equivalent of WhatsApp, or it's sort of like a, Twitter. It's the Twitter of China, called WeChat. I saw in Chinese a really funny sort of gallows humor joke about, well, if it had been an Israeli plane, or if it had been a Russian plane, the standard sort of gallows humor joke. And I translated it into English and put it on my website. And in that this was right after in like late March. And I put a map above that article which showed the 2 potential routes that the plane might have taken, one down into the southeastern Indian Ocean, and then the other one, up into, again, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Waziristan, Kazakhstan. And I just made the rhetorical question, why is nobody looking up north? And now try to find that map in the Western mainstream media. You can't find it. They chop it off.
No, it's not there. It's not there at all. Even the people, right? The conspiracy people like me are all, putting up stuff about the Indian Ocean and down by Australia and Diego Garcia, all this kind of stuff. But everywhere but where you're talking about.
And so anyway, this thing is like Ian Fleming couldn't write a better script for a James Bond movie. About a week after I did that article, almost if by divine providence, in Europe of all places, one of the busiest air traffic sectors in the world. Do you remember this? Dozens of commercial airliners went missing off of their very sophisticated air traffic control screens due to a high-tech NATO electronic war game. So, in fact, it was freaking out the public so much in Europe and in the United States, to a lesser extent, that NATO actually had to come out and say, okay, it's our fault. We made those planes disappear off of the air traffic control screens in Europe because we were playing electronic war games. And so,
practicing for another 9/11 plane swap.
Yeah. And so it's sort of like, well, if they can make dozens of airplanes, disappear, even if for just a few seconds, over one of the busiest, air traffic sectors in the world, then it seems reasonable that they could make one plane disappear for a longer period of time through some of the most, desolate, unpopulated areas of the world. And so I started doing my research, and there was an anonymous YouTube video which talked about the fact that there were actually 20 Chinese employees from Freescale Semiconductor that were on board that airplane, and they were actually heading where? They were heading to Beijing, Communist China. And
right.
four of these, and this is incredible, four of these employees shared a revolutionary, four of these Chinese employees shared a revolutionary patent on this new KL, I don't think it stands for Kuala Lumpur, but anyway, the KL-0 computer chip, which would be used for missile defenses, radar systems. And the patents were approved just 4 days after the disappearance of MH370. Therefore, the four Chinese patent holders could not legally pass the wealth and control of this patent on to their heirs. And that leaves the fifth shareholder of the patent as 100% owner, and that's Freescale Conductor. And
now who owns that?
Well, let me see. I'm going through my notes here. This is the anonymous news video brings up a ton of salient and salacious facts. He is talking about how it is actually owned by Jacob Rothschild.
Oh, no. The same guy who bought Charlie Hebdo before that happened. He turns up everywhere, doesn't he? The man whose name we must not speak.
And apparently, and also I think the Carlyle Group was involved.
Usual suspects.
Yeah, the usual suspects. But you can imagine if these guys had the technology in their brains, and there's speculation that maybe they even had one of these KL-0 chips to bring back to Beijing. Maybe they were double agents. I mean, like I say, this is. I mean, Ian Fleming couldn't even dream up something like this.
Yeah.
And so they. I mean, this chip is as big as your thumbnail. So they could have had it. And also, in any case, would the United States want these 20 cyber geniuses, or at least the four that had the patent? That had the patent. Would they want them going back to China and giving their their trade secrets, to the Ministry of State Security?
Wow. So if anybody's developing any really breakthrough type chips or anything like that, you should probably just go to China first and just develop it there.
That's right.
You'll never get there afterwards.
That's right. And then later there was, and then later it was like, okay, so let's, I want to ask you, Kevin. This is a question I have not been able to find on the internet, and maybe you know something that we can share with our listeners. Has a major airline, I'm talking like a 727, 747, 777, Airbus 320 or whatever, has one of those ever gone down in the ocean and there has never been one piece of debris or one piece of flotsam that has never been found? Has that ever happened, or do they always? Don't they always at least find like a life vest or something?
That's what I thought. Well, it's sort of like, usually when a plane crashes, you find some wreckage, but on 9/11, we ended up with a 10, 15-foot diameter hole with no wreckage. All that was left was a Shiite bandana and
and a
a forged
passport.
passport. And at the Pentagon, too, we had a plane that just kind of went into this little hole surrounded by unbroken glass, a 15-foot diameter hole, and it disappeared, too. So sometimes that happens. Planes crash, and then they just vanish.
I mean, the last one I could only come up with on as far as was the Air France flight off the coast of the northeast coast of Brazil in 2009. They found, flotsam and debris floating, and so I was thinking, well, if they didn't find one thing, and I just find that, very strong circumstantial evidence that it did not land in the ocean, which leaves the north, and so. Then there was an.
Wait a minute. What if it was remote hijacked and flown to Diego Garcia, which is the working hypothesis?
That's another one. But I don't think it went down in the ocean. That's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. We're on the same page there. So tell us about Kazakhstan and Central Eurasia.
What I found later was an article about an anonymous Russian in that part of the world. Kazakhstan, etc. Probably, maybe a KGB stringer. And he was reporting about the whereabouts of the MH370, and that he was saying that it was that it had landed in a valley. Those valleys, those long, narrow valleys, in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They've got roads. Going right, down the middle of these valleys, and it would be a perfect runway for for a plane to land, because these valleys go for kilometers. And he was saying that he had intelligence that the plane landed along the Afghan-Pakistan border, which is Waziristan, which is, no man's land, and that there were 20 Asian specialists on board who had been taken to a bunker in Pakistan, and according to his reports, and he was saying that it was corroborated by several intelligence agencies, and of course, the United States controls Pakistan's and Afghanistan's skies as much as they do the New York and
yeah, pretty much,
and Chicago, and. So, and he was saying that, he even got down into details. He was saying that the passengers were alive. Now, of course, this is quite a while ago. This is a year ago. But he was saying that they were alive, divided into 7 groups, living in mud huts southeast of Kandahar, and that the Chinese, the cyber geniuses that had this KL chip knowledge in their heads, could be used for blackmail or bargaining chips to sell, to a higher power, whatever. But it's clear that if it is true that there were 20 of these people working from Freescale on that plane, heading to China, that there's every reason to believe that plane, that the Americans did not want those guys going to Beijing, and that's where MH was flying from, was from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. So anyway, an interesting thing happened, Kevin. After I wrote that article, someone hacked my website, because it got a lot of traffic. I mean, it got, you can imagine, with it being right afterwards, and the Chinese and everything, it got a huge amount of traffic. It went sort of semi-viral around the world, and my website was hacked, and it was hacked in a very special way. Whoever hacked it just extirpated that one article out of about 90, just removed that one article, and then locked me out of my website so I couldn't get back into it, as if to send me a message: don't go reporting about this in the future. Can you imagine? Isn't that amazing? So,
it is.
And so he could have brought the whole site down, but he didn't. He or she only hacked that one article. They just took that one article out as if to tell me quit talking about this particular subject.
Wow.
And so luckily,
Where do you have that back? Do you have it back up now?
Yeah. Luckily I had an American friend here who's a bit of a tech head, and he was actually able to get me back into my website. And like a fool, I didn't know about SSL, and so after that I bought SSL, the secure socket locking thing with the 256-bit, password or code, whatever it is. So now, but I was so incensed that happened that that I didn't know, was it the West that did it? Was it the Chinese that did it? I didn't really know, and just to cover my bases, I had a friend of mine translate that article into Chinese, and I put them both back up after I got the SSL encryption. That's what it's called, encryption. And so after I got the SSL encryption, I put both of the articles back up, the one in English, and you can see them on my website, 44days.net. Just search MH370 on my website, and you'll see these. And after that, I put an article back up with a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator, holding his shotgun, saying "I'm back." So, and apparently that SSL technology, the 256-bit encryption, has kept whoever it was at bay, because no one's hacked my website since then. But it just goes to show you how powerful the forces are that we truth-telling journalists, writers, etc. work against. That these people are tirelessly trying to suppress alternative viewpoints.
That's right. Wayne Madsen has reported that there's supposedly 1,000 people at NSA whose full-time job was to keep a lid on 9/11. I don't know if they're still all doing that now. That was several years ago.
Wow. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
But and I know. I mean, the Russians know what happened to MH370. The Chinese know what happened to MH370, and the Americans know what happened to MH370. In fact, on one of the maps that I found back then, which is now completely completely censored. In fact, I just saw a recent map on CNN, and lo and behold, that map was cut off right above, the the place where it went down in the South China Sea, but we know, and I think this was reported by the Russians, that there was an Interstat 3F1 geostationary satellite, right over that, and they would have easily, which is controlled by the United States, and they could easily, they know what happened.
Mm-hmm. And this is kind of frustrating, and it relates to the situation you described earlier with the Chinese not being all that interested in helping expose the truth of 9/11. It seems like world governments are willing to be complicit in covering up each other's nefarious deeds. And they work against each other in so many ways. They're always strategically competing and planning for military confrontation and fighting it out in spy versus spy games. But it's fairly rare when somebody like, say, the Russians goes ahead and posts online a video of someone like Victoria Nuland saying that, we spent $5 billion to overthrow the democratically elected government of Ukraine. Well, I wonder, why don't they do more of this? Why can't these governments strategically enroll the global public and get public opinion on their side by doing this kind of stuff?
I don't know, Kevin. It's a good point. You had an article, a month or so ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, about the rumor that Putin was going to allow the FSB, the post-Soviet KGB, to release their 9/11 files. That never transpired, and you had a great theory about that. tell our listeners what your theory was as to why they
Well,
would
yeah,
want to do it?
I saw that as like a kind of not exactly mutual assured destruction, but it was the equivalent of a sort of a nuclear deterrent,
Yeah.
where he's got this stuff, this 9/11 information, and if he makes it public, that's going to cause a lot of instability at the high levels of the U.S.
Yeah.
But he can only do it once, and when and if he releases that, then of course there'll be pushback, and they'll try to deny it and say he's just making it up. It's all forged. There'll be all kinds of bad reactions, and then he'll be punished in whatever ways they can punish him. So basically, he's going to hang on to that as a kind of a nuclear deterrent. So if the U.S. were to push him too far, he could always say, "Hey, push me any further, and I'm going to release this." So I was hoping that things had reached that point, but the chances of it ever really reaching the point that it actually, Putin releases the 9/11 satellite photos, I don't know when that's going to be. I just wish he would, though. I think that these governments are willing to compete in so many other ways. Why can't they compete in goodness? The Quran tells us to compete in goodness.
Yeah.
Why don't they compete in transparency and goodness and, trying to bring the world's people up to speed on what's really going on?
Well, I think part of the problem, Kevin, is that first off, the Chinese speak Chinese, the Russians speak Russian. Okay, you have to tip your hat to Russia. They now have RT.com and Sputnik News. China has China Daily, but it's I mean, in the scheme of Western mainstream media, they are literally blips on the radar screen.
Yeah, why is China so far behind the curve? I mean, Iran, which is hardly in the mainstream of the West, has Press TV, which is fantastic. And Russia, RT isn't too bad either, but Telesur out of Venezuela is good.
Yeah, exactly, which I read every day. I think, again, the Chinese are very, hypersensitive about being called hypocritical, about, non-interference. They do have China Daily. Our listeners can, go look at China Daily, and they have, stuff on there. Although to really, they really need to actually look at, that's more of a kind of a newsy website. But there's Global Times and People's.
Yeah, I never really see any butt kicking stuff on China Daily. Like, do they ever really go after the Western powers that be?
Mostly, you'll find that on Global Times and People's Daily, which are more direct from the leadership and from the Communist Party, and there's where you get the hard-hitting editorials and the slam downs of the United States and Europe, and you have to really go to, and also Xinhua Net will also have some good stuff, and it's actually really good to go to because they're basically translations of the Chinese versions of those newspapers, and so you're really getting how the Chinese feel, and although there's a huge amount of denial in the West, the Chinese are not happy. I mean, Tibet, Xinjiang, they're just fed up, and and they know Ukraine, and they know that that the United States is trying to destroy any rapprochement between Germany and Russia, and trying to foil China's plans to interconnect Eurasia with rail and highway and gas pipelines and ports, etc. So, those are some good sites to take a look at, or you can listen to us talking together and, find out.
Yeah, that's right. If you want the real inside scoop from China, listen to Jeff Brown on Truth Jihad Radio.
That's right. So, it's really people just don't realize how much China has determined American and Western policy. I mean, the whole idea of containing China goes back to 1949. The Vietnam War and the South Korea and Taiwan and Japan and the Philippines. All of that has been and continues to be to contain China, and so China really has been the tail wagging the American dog. Well, now that tail is bigger than the dog, And with Russia, basically, combining their DNA with China, economically and intelligence-wise and politically, that tail is now, a huge mastiff, and the United States has got some very, very formidable, authoritative and muscular, challenges to its world hegemony. And it's just not the same world that it was even 5 or 10 years ago.
That's right. Well, you mentioned you wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine, and we just heard that the U.S. has actually sent troops into Ukraine.
Yeah, these so-called advisors. Does that sound like Vietnam in 1959?
Yeah, didn't they start with advisors? Yeah.
In Vietnam in 1959 with Eisenhower. My God.
Yeah. So what are they going to do for the Gulf of Tonkin incident that ramps it all up into full-scale war?
I wrote about this. China and the Ukraine had a huge amount of cooperation going back into the 70s. They had a lot of manufacturing and technology cooperation, during the Mao years and in the 80s with Deng Xiaoping, and so that was a twofer for the United States. To take down the Ukraine was a fencing lunge to the heart of of Russia, but it was also a bad blow for China. And they had grain deals. They had signed a multi-year contract to have hundreds of thousands of tons of grain to be shipped from the Ukraine to China. So that was you have to hand it to these dastardly people in the U.S.'s deep state. They really know how to screw things up.
Well, they're good at that. They can't put it back together, but they can sure break it.
So where is where is the southern route of they can't control. The U.S. can't screw up the northern Silk Road going up through Mongolia. They're now, Russia and China are now working very closely with Mongolia. There's no way they're going to be able to stop the northern route, the rail and road routes going from Beijing to Moscow to the north across Siberia. But the Chinese have huge plans to extend pipelines, highways, and high-speed rail through the southern route, which includes, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way in through Iran and the Ukraine. So the Chinese are extremely affected by Ukraine a lot more than even the Chinese want to admit in their media, and definitely the West, which completely ignores it.
Right. Well, that's the center of the grand chessboard, that southern route that you just described, and that's what Brzezinski said that the U.S. had to control if they were going to try and control the world from North America, which is a very difficult project. The vast majority of the world's productivity is happening over in Eurasia.
Yeah,
so how do you rule the world from North America? That's almost as crazy as trying to rule it from Australia or Antarctica or Greenland or something. You have to go and take over the middle of the grand chessboard. And he published that not long before 9/11, and boom, now there we are over in Afghanistan and controlling that airspace in Afghanistan and Pakistan that you described, ready to screw up the southern Silk Road. And it's just a matter, I think, of whether the U.S. economy is up to maintaining the military to keep this imperial hegemony going. And I don't think it is. I think it's going to be gradually going down.
Well, I turn 61 next week, and I hope it happens in my lifetime, but I don't know. I don't again, there's the power of the mainstream media, and I think that's why Putin and the Russians and the Chinese don't come out, because unfortunately with the 24-hour news cycle and the manipulation of the mainstream media and the censoring in the mainstream media and the our show today will be listened to by a few thousand people, but not millions. And in fact, if it became millions, we would probably both be killed. And
let's just keep it in the thousands. And if there are millions of you listening, please don't make yourselves too obvious.
Go watch American Idol.
That's right. Turn this off. You don't want to know the truth anyway, do you?
But I just, just think about this. In Xinjiang, which for our readers, it's a huge province in China. It's the size of Iran, but it's only got 22 million people. I think Iran has about 75 or 80 million. It's mostly Muslim. It's got huge deposits of mineral and gas, and it is the key hub for, China's Silk Roads into the south, and to connect Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, etc. And the latest information that the National Endowment for Democracy I was able to find posted, it's still there. They'll probably take it down eventually. But in 2012, in their annual budget, they budgeted $698,000 for supposedly non-governmental organizations, but they're very governmental because that money came from U.S. taxpayers. And for democracy, well, and I read in another article that was over 700,000 in 2014. So what this is, they're spending about almost $1 million a year to destabilize Xinjiang. Just to let you know how transparent their intentions are, they also call it not just Xinjiang, which is the name of the Chinese province, but they also, on the NED website, they call it East Turkestan, like it's its own country. And I want our listeners to think about this. Imagine the Chinese calling Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, northern Mexico.
North Mexico.
Yeah, North Mexico, and funding a bunch of disgruntled citizens to commit acts of terrorism on American soil, for independence. Sadly to say, they'd probably get a huge response because there's so many, upset people in the States right now about the police state it's becoming. But can you imagine, and then they wonder, then people, blissfully wonder why the Chinese are so, absolutely furious. If you hear fireworks going off in the background, someone's blowing off.
Oh, they're really getting furious.
This happens all the time. Can you hear the fireworks or not?
Yeah. What's the fireworks show about?
It could be anything. It could be a store opening. It could be a local business. It could be anything. So this happens all the time, and luckily it's happening after 8 o'clock. Usually, sometimes it happens at 7 a.m. when we're still trying to sleep in late on the weekends. So yeah, they go off like this all the time. So anyway.
Wow. Well, China invented gunpowder to scare away the evil spirits, which is a better use for it than killing people.
Yeah. They also invented guns too, but they didn't go around the rest of the world trying to take it over like the West did. It's an irony of history that the Chinese invented the compass, they invented paper, they invented the block and movable press, and they invented gunpowder. And they use those for their own use to defend themselves. And let's face it, they took over some territory here and expanded their empire. But it was the West that took those four inventions and turned around and turned the tables on China and everybody else and used those four inventions to, dominate the world for the next 500 years. An amazing irony of history. But anyway.
It is, yeah. I wonder if we'll ever return to kind of a stable world governed by these not so imperialistic and super hyperactive, ultra technologically driven kinds of civilizations. Do you think history is going to return to a more stable situation?
Well, I realize China's not perfect. I don't think there's I don't think the Chinese are pulling off any false flags internally right now because they don't need to, because the United States and Europe are, doing it in spades in, Xinjiang. They kind of cooled off in Tibet because it's been a miserable failure for the last 50, 60 years, but now they've turned their guns, to Xinjiang. But has China committed false flags in their history? Well, I'm sure they've committed many of them, to maintain their rule and control of the people that they were,
Well, Sun Tzu's Art of War suggests that you win the war before any battles are even fought by psychological manipulation. So, if Chinese weren't doing any false flags, they probably weren't paying attention.
No, but they don't have to now. But and I would like to ask our readers, well, that first off they can go to my website and learn a lot. Oops, another round of fireworks. They laid out another set. This will be one of the most culturally colorful shows you've ever had, Kevin.
Indeed. When fireworks go off while I'm doing the show, my listeners worry that the men in black have arrived. This is not posse comitatus being violated in the United States. Right.
I'm in Beijing.
Jade Helm. Oh my God, it's Jade Helm. Bang, bang, bang.
I'm not in Madison, Wisconsin. But
all right.
We
only have a few minutes, and I don't think we really got much to Flight 17, Malaysian 17. Wasn't that the one from Amsterdam? Got shot down, probably by a Ukrainian fighter jet.
Yeah, that stinks. And the fact that the what's it called? Air control in Kiev, told the guy to change his route, and he actually was supposed to. I've seen maps showing the previous routes of planes flying from Europe to Asia, and they all went well south of the Donbass area. And on that particular day, as if it was just by happenstance, Kiev actually instructed the pilot to veer north, which would have taken, which put him right over the Donbass. And after that, no other, it was just that one plane was asked to fly over the Donbass, during that time period. So yeah, the whole thing stinks to high heaven, and I've seen pictures of that, of the left side of the airplane, or the 30 millimeter. They're just riddled with, bullet holes, right where the pilot was sitting. Yeah. That kind of looks more like a shoot down from a plane than a missile. Absolutely. But you know what? They were coming out. Wasn't there some kind of baloney? I'll be honest with you. I can't keep up with everything outside. I'm so concentrated on writing Xi Jinping's diaries.
Well, the false flags are coming so fast, nobody can keep up.
Yeah, you're doing the Lord's work, Kevin.
I feel like Charlie Chaplin on the assembly line, just trying to keep up.
Or Lucille Ball.
Yeah.
But there was some baloney last week, wasn't there? That some European guy came out and another preposterous, saying it was a Buk Russian missile. There was a tweet or something from some Brussels official or something. But unfortunately, when RT comes out with a relatively, you even have to hand it to RT. They even show both sides. They'll sit there and say, well, yeah, but the Americans say this, but here's what we also found out. That tweet about the Buk went around the world, and in 24 hours, and was on, CNN and everything else, and all the major newspapers. But when RT, comes out with something that shows an alternative version, it stays with RT, maybe Russian Insider and guys like you and me. And I think that's why Russia and China are so reluctant. As you say, I think they realize it's almost like it would be a waste, of their most powerful, maybe weapon psyop weapon they have. But I think the question is how do they get it out to the 315 million Americans and the 500 million Europeans? That's the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you wonder if there might be some kind of strategy for that. If a really good sort of geopolitical chess master could sit down and figure out, well, we do this, they do that, and work it out a lot of ways. I mean, it's possible that that kind of thinking could eventually lead to a strategy for getting it out.
I don't know. I do know that that RT is scaring the crap out of the West. There was the guy from the National Broadcasting Association, National Association of Broadcasters, who compared RT to Ebola.
Yeah.
And
but see, this isn't working.
And ISIS.
Putin is still more popular in the U.S. than any of the American candidates.
Yeah.
I actually suggested starting a Putin for president movement. So the propaganda really isn't working very well.
When your Congress and your president both, in the polls, rate just slightly above a dog turd.
Yeah. Right,
it's not hard.
That's right. Yeah, and it's looking like, everybody is talking about the next presidential election is a Clinton versus a Bush. That just seems to be a perfect summary of everything that's wrong.
It's depressing. I had someone, my wife is French, and in fact, I have a French passport and an American passport, and we hang out with a lot of French people. I love them; they're great people, and lived there for 5 years. And they were saying, well, who are you
Alors, il faut faire le programme en français la prochaine fois.
La prochaine fois, absolutely.
Yeah, we're going to do it in French next time for all you Anglophiles out there.
And but anyway, they said, who are you going to vote for? And I said, neither. In 2012, I hand wrote in, Jill Stein for the Green Party, and I even called the Oklahoma. I emailed them. I emailed the Oklahoma County election board and said, what's going to happen if I, write in Jill Stein? And they said, well, we will not disqualify your other votes, the state questions and the state House and the state Senate and all that, but we will not even recognize or record any handwritten. So I did vote for Jill Stein in 2012, and I think I still will, because there's, she's the only, short of, of a Ralph Nader or
I voted for Merlin Miller last time of the American Eagle Party. He's a radio guest I've had, a filmmaker, and a Take Back America guy. Merlin's a good guy. He's doing the American Eagle Party. I think the American Eagle Party and Tax Wall Street Party, maybe with Cynthia McKinney jumping on board, people like that. We may have something going that's going to cause a little trouble in the next elections. I don't know about winning anything, but hope springs eternal, I guess. Well, hey, we're hearing the music, Jeff. So quickly, we're hitting the end of the hour. What's your website?
My website is www.44days.net, 44days.net. Please take a look.
Okay, looking forward to the next conversation with Jeff Brown. Thanks, Jeff. And we'll be back soon. Green Chris Emery.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back after this message.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm